Hi there, welcome to Read by the Author. This is episode 6 of season 3. Tonight we are continuing Time Anomaly, so let's get back to the story. 14. Lovers and Wives. When I entered the courtyard, a small crowd of young men were milling around Heru near the gate, their skin tones varying from Heru's golden tan to the darker brown of my gardener friend. Each was lean and fit, obviously well-fed, and dressed similarly to Heru in above-the-knee white linen kilts, and every eye watched my approach. Self-conscious, I tucked my hair behind my ear and offered the group a hesitant smile as I neared, stopping a few feet from Heru. "What are they here for?" I asked, sweeping my gaze around the crowd of young men. They were quiet, watching us both. "They are our porters for the day," Heru told me. My eyes widened. There were so many of them. Heru tilted his head to the side ever so slightly, studying me. "Or did you think you and I would lug back all of the merchandise ourselves?" My neck and cheeks flushed, but I kept my gaze steady on him. It wasn't difficult. Heru's eyes had always captivated me, and they weren't disappointing at the moment. I supposed I did not give the matter much thought. Evidently. I fought the urge to grind my teeth. I wanted to shout at him that I wasn't really an idiot, that I was only acting like one because in my time everything was done differently. But I couldn't. I'd barely known this version of Heru for a day. I took a slow, calming, deep breath. I was not aware that so many young men were employed in this house. Heru broke eye contact, doing a visual assessment of the group. "They are not, but I tasked a few of our own to find a few more who were willing to help out this afternoon, and now we have attained more than enough helpers." He hesitated, his attention returning to me. The path his eyes trailed over my face was almost palpable, tracing my nose, my cheekbones, my jaw, and my lips before returning to my eyes. "It would seem that word of Nuen's queen has spread." I ran my hands down the front of my dress, smoothing the soft linen skirt unnecessarily. "What do you mean by that?" Heru shook his head. "Nothing. Forget I said anything." He gripped my elbow and guided me through the gate, releasing me as soon as we were walking along the street's slightly uneven paving stones. Unlike the previous day, when the roads had been all but empty, there were now people everywhere, rushing around or pausing in front of tall mud brick walls to chat. There was even a pair of men repairing a portion of a villa wall that had collapsed. We headed in the opposite direction of the canal docks. Heru's strides were long and nothing close to leisurely, and the pace wasn't overly conducive to casual conversation. "Are we walking the whole way?" I asked. Heru glanced at me like I was dim-witted. "Instead of taking a canal boat?" "Yes." "Is it very far?" "Not too far." "How long will it take?" "A quarter of an hour," he said, his words clipped. Lucky for me, the ancient Egyptians divided their day into 24 hours, much like the people from my time, 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night. A quarter of an hour was a period of time that had genuine meaning to me. Finally, something was familiar. For several minutes neither of us spoke. Our small parade of porters chattered away behind us, but the silence between Heru and me thickened until it was almost choking. Unable to stand it any longer, I blurted, "Listen, Heru, I feel awful about you losing your usual position as Nuen's blade. I completely understand if you blame me for—" "Did you ask Nuen to order me to be your companion while you traded at the markets?" No, I did not." "Then I have no reason to blame you." I took a few breaths, willing myself to hold my tongue. I failed. "But you do blame me. You will barely even look at me, let alone speak with me. You must think—" "I do not." I curled my fingers into fists and growled in frustration. "Why are you always so—" "You speak as if you know me," Heru said. "You do not." His words were as effective as a slap. I stopped walking and stared at him as he continued on. The porters stopped as well, fanning out behind me. It only took Heru a few seconds to catch on, but he was already a dozen feet ahead. He slowed, stopped, and turned. I looked away, watching a pair of women who appeared to be in their mid-30s chat in front of a two-story building. Clearing my throat, I swiped my cheeks with one hand. I refused to let Heru see the devastating effect he could have on me. He couldn't understand the reason why. Out of my peripheral vision, I watched him retrace his steps until he was standing in front of me. He raised his hand and gently touched my shoulder.
That was unduly harsh. I apologize.
I swallowed and cleared my throat again, but I said nothing as I continued to watch the women. They were arguing in hushed tones. About what? Their children, maybe? Or possibly some gossip gone bad? Heru slid his hand down the length of my arm to my hand. He held my fingers, not entwining them with his own as I was used to, but just held them. I choked back a convulsive sob. I miss you so much.
You are alone and far from your home, he said softly. For whatever reason, you have abandoned your former life to come here and be with the Great Father.
He sighed and ran his free hand over the closely shaved black hair on his scalp.
Secrets surround you, and Nguyen has chosen to confide in Set rather than in me. That is what is bothering me, not you.
I finally looked at him.
You appear surprised.
I bit my lip, unsure how much I could safely tell him, and averted my gaze. The two women had abandoned their argument and were now watching us. I met Heru's golden tiger eyes once again.
Why do so many secrets surround you?
He asked. I cannot tell you that, I said softly, and even if I could, you would not believe me.
You do not know that,
When I flinched at the near use of my misnomer, he amended what he'd been about to say.
Alexandra, you do not know what I will and will not believe.
But I did, because I knew him. I knew this man as well as I knew myself. A tear snuck out of the corner of my eye before I could blink it away. I hated it, all of the crying, the lying, the pretending. Please just trust me when I say that I cannot tell you, I implored, my eyes pleading. Heru raised his hand almost like he intended to wipe away that rogue tear, but stopped himself halfway and lowered it back to his side.
This morning, when I asked you about Onkesempepi and how you had made an enemy of her so quickly, why did you say that it was because of me?
I squinted up at the clear afternoon sky. The sun was still blazing high overhead. Are you sure you want to know?
Yes,
he said, the single word a cross between a growl and a hiss. I inhaled slowly, considering how to tell him. She threatened me last night. I lowered my gaze, leveling it on him. She cornered me during the feast, berated me for stealing her power, and told me that she knew about our conversation in Nguyen's chambers when we were alone together, and that if I did not stay away from you, she would tell everyone that we had been, I cleared my throat, intimate. Heru's face darkened. So you are really only part of the issue, I said, offering him an apologetic smile. She thinks I want to take her power from her, but honestly, I do not. Heru returned my smile, his warm and familiar in a way that ignited so many intense feelings within me.
Because of what you are and who you are a wife to, in time you will have more power than any other woman who has ever lived. An unexpected, slightly hysterical laugh bubbled up from my chest, and I wrapped my arms around my middle. I never wanted any of this. Being Netjer-At, having a life that could span eons, being married to a man who is the ruler of his people, absorbing a foreign power, having to abandon my love, living 4,000 years before my mom was born. I just wanted to live my life, and I shrugged and shook my head. I just wanted to live my life. Much to my surprise, Heru chuckled. Now that is something I can relate to. I had no idea what he was talking about. Marcus loved being Netjer-At and thrived when he was in control.
Power was his bread and butter.
I will speak with Kessie. Tell her to cease this cat crawl.
Cat crawl? Heru stepped closer and placed a hand on the small of my back, urging me to resume walking with the faintest pressure.
You are unfamiliar with the expression?
I nodded and smiled, letting him lead me. He retracted his hand, his fingertips skimming along my lower back before they were gone completely. It wasn't intentional, I told myself. It didn't mean anything. But my racing heartbeat and electrified nerves weren't overly receptive to logic.
It is when two cats circle one another slowly, clearly antagonistic, but neither attacking.
Oh, I see. Again, I nodded. That makes sense. We rounded a corner, and the paved street gave way to sandy, hard-packed dirt, crowded with people. The buildings ahead were far less sprawling and grandiose than the villas and temples of the previous lane. These, if I was interpreting them correctly, were the conjoined two-story townhouses common to the majority of the Egyptian populace during this era. They were akin to the mud-brick brethren of San Francisco's famous terraced homes, minus the intricate moldings, glass windows, and bright paints.
How is the kitten?
Heru asked.
What are you calling him?
Russ, I said, half expecting him to shout,
Aha! You named him after me!
Which was silly. The name Horus hadn't been used for the god Heru until the Ptolemaic period, when the Greeks ruled Egypt. He seems to be enjoying his new home. I glanced at Heru. Where did he come from?
He is from the latest litter of my local wife's favorite cat.
I choked on my own saliva as he spoke. Your local wife? And here I'd thought knowing he had some sort of a relationship with Ankhesenpepi would be the extent of the torture I would have to endure in this time. I should have known better. At his curious expression, I offered him a pathetic attempt for a smile. Pardon me, please, I frowned and shook my head. What with your relationship with Ankhesenpepi, I suppose I did not consider that you would have other wives as well.
Heru's expression hardened. Kessie is not one of my wives, and she never will be.
But she... Why not? Heru looked affronted.
Why would I ever take her as a wife? Kessie is Netjar'at. What would be the purpose of such a union, other than to increase her power and standing? There would be no benefit to me.
I almost couldn't believe the words I was hearing pour out of his mouth. And your wife?
Wives. I have 3.
Heru focused on the way ahead, and I had the impression that he was avoiding looking at me. My eyes widened. Your wives. You married them because doing so benefits you in some way? I blushed. Other than the obvious. Heru chuckled, but it sounded forced.
Children, of course, and affection.
I felt a sick sort of curiosity and couldn't help myself. I asked, what are they like, your wives? Because the only 2 women I had met who he'd been involved with, Ankhesenpepi and a human woman from my time, Sarah, were pretty despicable examples of my gender, and I wasn't sure I wanted to think too much about what that said about me.
Mariette is the only one who resides in Mennefer, Heru said. She is where Russ comes from.
I squeezed my eyes shut in a protracted blink. What is it with Netjar'at men and their need for multiple wives? It wasn't like polygamy was widely practiced in ancient Egypt. That was only a misperception held by many people in my time. And there are 2 more?
Yes.
Heru sounded hesitant.
You speak of them like such a thing is strange. Is it not a common practice among the male Netjar'ats of your homeland to take multiple wives?
I imagined Marcus politely requesting permission to take a human wife. No, definitely not. I cleared my throat for what seemed like the dozenth time in only a few minutes. And I suppose considering I now have my own sister wives, I would like to learn more about how it works between a man and his wives. After I replayed my words in my mind, my cheeks burned again. I did not mean how it works. I know that. But, Heru chuckled, and the sound set me aflame, soul, heart, and libido alike. I hoped desperately that he wouldn't sense my reaction. I swallowed. Please forget I said anything about it. He ignored my request.
I maintain my wives' accommodations, and they provide potential new Netjar-Ots. Mariette resides in Mennefer permanently, along with our 3 surviving children.
He continued, but the one word, surviving, resounded in my head, drowning out whatever else he was saying. Heru and Mariette had buried at least one child. Heru had buried children, his own children. I'd known that. I had known he had watched countless of his descendants be born, grow to adulthood, and eventually die. I just hadn't thought. I'm so sorry about all those you have lost. I cannot imagine how hard that must be, I told him, my words laden with sympathy, but not empathy. I had never lost a child, and I never would. Negeret's bodies, or rather, manifested Negeret's bodies, rejected any fetuses almost immediately after fertilization due to our hyper-regenerative abilities. It was only reproduction through the males of our kind that we were able to carry on as a species at all.
I am grateful for those who have survived,
he said, and I caught his wayward glance. It was filled with pity, of all things.
I cannot imagine what it would be like to have never had any children at all.
I let out a breathy, bitter laugh. Even if I had eventually wanted children, that avenue was permanently closed to me. It is better to have loved them and lost them than to have never loved them at all, I said, quoting Tennyson in the original tongue as best I could. Squinting thoughtfully, Heru nodded.
I have not heard it phrased as such, but yes, I think you have captured my meaning.
More than you know, I said under my breath. Heru didn't respond, so I pretended that he hadn't heard me. He had, and we both knew it. Author's note. So it's kind of funny going back and reading this, because this was written in a time in my life when I didn't think that I was going to have kids. So clearly I was preoccupied with the idea of children and childbearing and fertility. It's just interesting. I mean, it must have been coming up from my subconscious. It's just super interesting to look back. 15. Supply and demand. Heru and I rounded a corner and walked into a throng wilder and louder than any farmer's market I had ever seen. A seemingly endless sea of people were hawking their wares under brightly dyed canopies, haggling relentlessly with their potential customers. And beyond the crowd stretched a glittering blue-gray mass sprinkled with a smattering of white specks. The Nile! The ancient, beautiful Nile, teeming with vessels. It was such a chaotic, wondrous scene that it was almost magical. I snagged Heru's wrist, drawing him to a halt. Give me a moment, please. I just need a moment to take it all in. Heru barked something at our young porters, and they circled around us, creating a barrier between us and this wild, exotic marketplace. Oh, I said with a low laugh. There is no way you are keeping me separated from this. You have no idea how long I have dreamed of. To see this with my own eyes, to experience it? I tore my attention away from the miasma of commerce and pinned Heru with my gaze. How does this work? I raised my little box of turquoise beads. How do I barter? Heru glanced down, but his eyes quickly returned to my face, where they lingered.
I will guide you to the stalls of the merchants who are the fairest and have the best merchandise. You will tell me which items you favor, and I will barter for you. He held out his hand, palm up. Give me a few of your beads so I have something to show the vendors. Are they all turquoise, or are any of the quartz or gold or silver pieces in there?
I raised my eyebrows, wondering just how closely he had examined my dress, knowing the man Heru would one day become. Pretty damn closely. I started unlooping the leather cord securing the box, suddenly grateful for my ring of young, sturdy porters. I didn't think waving money around was wise in any time period. It's just turquoise, I said, once I had the box open. I plucked out a few pieces to hand to Heru, then resecured the leather binding. Is it of high enough quality? Will we be able to get everything we need?
And then some,
Heru murmured. He scanned me from head to toe, then back up again, and his black-rimmed gold irises swallowed me.
Though I do miss the dress.
My heart skipped a beat, and the corner of my mouth quirked up. This Heru was as much my perfect match as mine was. There was no denying that. Not for either of us. My mood sobered. Our compatibility just meant I had to be that much more careful around him. If we bonded... You probably should not say things like that, I told him.
Because of Nguyen.
Because of Ankhesenpepi, I countered, and it was partially the truth. Heru's eyes darkened.
You do not need to worry about Kessie. I told you I would speak with her.
I snorted. I was fairly certain that dear Kessie was a tenacious little Nezarette, and I didn't think a scolding, especially not one from Heru, would do any good at all. And I wish you the best of luck with that. Before he could respond, I grabbed his forearm and yanked him out of our protective ring. Where shall we start?
You need clothing. Additional clothing, he said,
briefly glancing down the length of my body. For once he didn't pull away from my touch, and we walked arm in arm past several stalls.
Kulain is the seamstress favored by Aset and Mariette, so let us begin here,
he said, stopping in front of a stall that wouldn't seem out of place in an arts and crafts fair. Woven reed mats had been set out on the ground, creating a cleaner setting for the vendors' goods, which was important considering that the baskets arranged around 3 sides of the stall were filled with piles and piles of pristine white linen. Above each basket, on something that reminded me of the old-fashioned coat rack in the entryway of Grandma Sousa's house, hung several garments. The vendor's way of displaying what was in each basket, I supposed. Each was a dress of some sort, hem lengths ranging from just below the knee to just above the ankle, and with several variations on the 2-strip bodice similar to that of the shift I was wearing. There were several women in the stall, 2 conversing and 1 kneeling while she held up a thin ribbon of linen to various parts of another woman's body. Her nude body. I hastily looked away. One of the women, deep in conversation, noticed us, glanced our way briefly, and then did a double take. She touched the other woman on the shoulder, murmured something, and nodded, and the other woman slipped away with a polite smile for Heru and me.
Kulain,
Heru said as the remaining woman approached us. He said something to her in the common tongue. Kulain clasped her hands together in front of her and lowered her head in a slight bow, murmuring what I assumed was a polite response to Heru's greeting. When she raised her head, her eyes slid to me. She scanned me slowly from the feet up, more of a mental measurement than the sizing up I had received from Ankhesenpepi. Her lips spread into a broad smile when she reached my face, and she said something I couldn't understand. Author's note. So I just feel like I need to mention, the market, like pretty much everything that has to do with Old Kingdom Egypt, there's like very small amounts of evidence that actually exists in the archaeological record, and much of what we know, it comes from tombs and is an idealized version of things. So it's most of our knowledge about Old Kingdom Egypt is very speculative. So yeah, there's a lot of artistic liberties that have been taken here of me just trying to fill in the holes of what I imagine it might have been like. Yeah. I mean, I based everything on any fact that there is, but there's just not a lot of facts. I always try to, because Old Kingdom Egypt is like my favorite time period to write in. I just keep going back there. I try always to make sure that nothing that I write contradicts the actual archaeological record. So it could be real. It could have been like this. I caught Heru's eye and raised my eyebrows in silent question.
She says she heard that Nguyen took a divine wife, but she did not believe the rumors until now.
Heru translated. The dressmaker watched our exchange curiously, waiting until we fell silent to speak again. Heru responded to her incomprehensible words with a slight nod.
I am letting her know that I will be translating your exchange with her to ensure you get everything you need.
I leaned in closer to Heru and kept my voice low. I have no idea what I need, just so you know. Heru stared down at me, the corner of his mouth curving upward. Apparently I had amused him.
I shall let her know that you need a full wardrobe.
I smiled. Thank you. Heru continued to stare down at me for another few seconds, his eyes turning troubled before he blinked, and looked away. He passed the message on to Kalain, who promptly took my hand and guided me further into the alcove that made up her stall until we were standing near the other two women. She grasped the skirt of my shift on either side of my hips and began to raise it. I clasped her wrists, holding her hands and my dress in place. What are you doing? When she shook her head, I looked at Heru. What is she doing?
I believe she is attempting to unclothe you.
My eyes bulged and I swung my head around to look at him. Why is she trying to unclothe me?
Heru frowned. So she can determine which garments fit you best.
His voice had taken on the "I am talking to an idiot" tone I was growing used to. I pressed my lips together. Public nudity wasn't nearly as taboo to these people as it was to those of my time. I had known it prior to traveling back here, but looking around, it was an unavoidable fact. Many of the women were walking around only in skirts, breasts exposed, and some were wearing only skimpy linen loincloths. I am not taking this dress off out in the open where everyone can see me, I said. Heru raised one eyebrow.
Are you ashamed?
I opened my mouth, then closed it, unsure how to respond. No, but where I come from, being naked is a private matter.
He shrugged. Very well.
He said something to Kalain, who frowned but released her hold on my dress. She turned away from me, speaking to Heru while she rummaged through her stock. She pulled a few garments from each basket, holding each item up against my body and tossing a few back into their original containers. The rest she placed in a tall, oval, woven reed basket. By the time she finished, I had several dozen new dresses, some as light and sheer as silk chiffon, which I was definitely relegating as sleepwear only, and some thick enough that they almost made up for my lack of bra or underwear. Going commando all the time was going to take more than a day to get used to. Watching a slender young servant girl pass wearing only a delicate golden circlet around her neck and a black loincloth that resembled modern bikini briefs, I had a brilliant idea. Maybe I could find some underwear. I tapped Kalain's arm and pointed to the girl. Kalain shook her head, clearly not understanding my request. I exhaled heavily and strode over to Heru. Do women ever wear something under their dresses like what that young woman is wearing? I asked, again pointing to the nearly naked servant. Heru's brow furrowed.
Would that not be a bit confining?
He shook his head.
No, it is better to let everything breathe.
I don't know why that cracks me up, but it totally does.
Oh, Heru.
I know, mansplaining underwear. He totally is. He shook his head.
No, it is better.
I don't know why this line is killing me.
No, it is better to let everything breathe.
I glanced down the length of hard-packed muscle that covered his body, lingering on his kilt. Due to the way it was wrapped around his body and knotted just under his navel, the linen garment hung longer around the back and sides, and pulled up to about mid-thigh in the front, with a longer flap hanging down the center. I knew exactly what those linen folds hid, and thinking that he wasn't nearly as concealed as I had assumed was going to drive me just a little bit mad. So you just walk around letting it all hang out? I asked. Heru fought it for a moment, but his lips spread into a wide grin, and he laughed out loud.
Let it all hang out, he repeated. Indeed, I do. As does your husband. How do you not know this?
I shrugged.
You should pay more attention next time you and he...
Awareness dawned on his face, and he leaned in closer, his nostrils flaring as he inhaled deeply. When he pulled away, his eyebrows were raised and his golden irises were bright.
Except it would not be a next time, because there has been no first time.
We are not talking about this. I spun away from him. He caught my arm, holding me in place long enough to whisper,
"He is a fool,"
then released me. My heart was pounding and seemed to have relocated to my throat. Heru thought Nguyen was neglecting me, and he felt sorry for me. I longed to tell him the truth, that the marriage was a farce, and that I was from the future and truly bonded to him, but that wasn't an option. While I watched Heru complete the transaction with Kalain, I remained silent, my expression guarded. I paid her a small handful of turquoise beads when Heru directed me to do so. He sent 2 porters back to the villa, one carrying the basket filled with the dresses we had purchased and one carrying a thick bundle of several different types of linen, all folded and rolled tightly and wrapped in a protective reed sheath that reminded me of a sushi roller. Each stop after that was much the same, aside from the vendors not attempting to strip off my clothes. We spent some time at a stall that offered a wide assortment of containers. Most were a variation on the lidded basket Kalain had packed my purchased clothing in, but there was a smattering of wooden boxes and chests as well. Heru selected several baskets of different sizes, then helped me pick a cosmetic chest, the ancient Egyptian version of a vanity. I only had 3 options, so it wasn't like the decision was excessively difficult. Unless you're me, and then you would spend like an hour deciding. I settled on a piece much like Nguyen's, constructed from a polished brownish red wood and inlaid with ivory in geometric patterns around the border of each face. After we paid, Heru removed a dozen more beads from my little treasure box and handed them to the last of our porters. The young man listened to Heru's instructions, then trotted off into the throng of shoppers, traders, and other porters. I watched as the crowd swallowed him up. "Where is he going?" I asked Heru.
"He can gather the amenities you will need to fill that chest easily enough on his own."
I cocked my head to the side.
"We are running out of daylight, and I dislike the idea of keeping you out in the street once the sun has died."
Not set, but died, which seemed appropriate considering the sun, symbolizing the god Ra, was believed to enter the land of the dead every night as it sank into the western horizon, then re-emerge into the land of the living as it rose each morning in the east.
"The jeweler will be our last stop today. If there is anything else you need, we can send someone out tomorrow morning before we depart."
"Okay." He placed a hand on the small of my back and remained close as he guided me through a crowd that showed no signs of thinning. We were nearing the Nile's western bank, and the people bustling around us were becoming more unseemly looking, their linen clothing dirtier and tattered, and their bodies in need of a good wash. I tilted my head so my mouth was angled up toward Heru's ear. "Is this the bad part of the market?" He kept a wary eye on the crowd.
"It did not used to be, but with the droughts."
"There have been droughts?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. Years of back-to-back droughts that devastated the agricultural industry was another unproven, and mostly unprovable, theory for the fall of the 6th dynasty and the Old Kingdom of Egypt. I was seeing firsthand that it might not be just a theory. Heru nodded.
"This is the 8th consecutive year with an insufficient Akhet."
Akhet being one of the 3 seasons the ancient Egyptians divided their year into, along with Peret and Shemu. It translated more or less into inundation. It was a several-month period during which the Nile would flood, inundating the floodplains with silt and leaving behind incredibly fertile black soil once it receded. One of the ancients' names for their land was Kemet, which literally meant black in reference to the silty soil, their life blood. If this was the 8th year in a row with a poor inundation, then food yields would be nearly non-existent. "They're starving," I said, a lump forming in my throat as I observed the people around me through this new lens. There were mothers carrying crying babies, bartering with grain vendors at a near shout, while children old enough to walk clutched their legs, most nude and little more than skin and bones. Even I could hear the mother's desperation, though I couldn't understand their words. "Please, my babies are starving. They'll die. We'll make payment next week, I swear. Please." There must be some stores of food, or maybe... But I didn't know enough about ruling an ancient civilization to suggest anything beyond that. I looked up at Heru, my eyes wide with horror. The Netraot must have seen this coming. You could have stalked up, prepared.
We did what we could. It is why Kessie has been stationed by the Pharaoh's side for the past several generations, he said, sliding his hand along my back and curving his fingers around the side of my waist to pull me closer. One glance up at his face told me he wasn't doing it out of a desire to cuddle. There was a dangerous glint in his eyes, a promise of death for any who even considered attempting to steal from me. You did not do enough, I murmured. I may not have known exactly why the story ended the way it did, but I knew the end of the story. The civilization, these people, they were dying. Heru's hand clenched on my waist. The drought was not supposed to last this long. In all of the possible futures, the previous Akhet was normal, making this Shemu, which was a time of harvest, plentiful. He shook his head, almost in disbelief. None of us saw this. An icy chill washed over me despite the stifling heat. Because of me. You could not see this possible future because of me. It is my fault. Heru glanced down at me. What? The Odd. It does not act normally where I am concerned, I explained carefully. If you look for me in it, you will not find me, not in the past, the present, or the possible near futures. You could not see this devastating possibility because I am in this future, this present. Heru was shaking his head. I do not see how such a thing is possible. I flashed him a small, sad smile. I know. It's one of those secrets I told you that you would not believe. Heru pressed his lips together and didn't respond. On our left there was a doorway. 2 burly men stood on either side, holding long spears with stone spearheads and wearing leather belts around their waists of their kilts, a heavy mace hanging from a loop on each man's hip. Armed guards? I said, looking at Heru. Is this the jeweler's? I wasn't positive, but I was fairly certain there hadn't been actual jewelry shops in Old Kingdom Egypt. Heru shook his head. This is the residence of the dockmaster. I know him well. He nodded to each of the guards and led me through the narrow doorway. It was short enough that he had to duck to make it past the threshold. I did not wish to alarm you, but we are being followed. You will be safe here while I take care of it. I grabbed his arm with both of my hands, feeling the play of muscles under his skin as he attempted to pull away. You will simply leave me here alone? But... Heru gently peeled my fingers from his arm. No, I will leave you here with Weni, and once the issue has been dealt with, I will return. He turned away from me and called out. Weni, he said more, but as usual I couldn't understand him. Weni's voice preceded him as he appeared in the back doorway. He looked to be in his late 20s and was lean, though not scrawny like most of the people milling around near his residence, and as was the fashion, his sleek black hair was parted down the middle and nearly reached his shoulders. His skin was a few shades darker than Heru's, and his face was pleasant if not exactly handsome, though the roguish glint to his eyes weighed in his favor on the handsome scale. He looked from Heru to me, then back to Heru, his lips spreading into a decidedly lascivious grin. Whatever he was saying to Heru as he approached and embraced him, I had the distinct feeling it would have made me blush profusely had I been able to understand him. Heru laughed and shook his head, glancing back at me a few times while he spoke to Weni. After a short exchange, he clapped his friend on the back and returned to me. I will not be long. Weni does not speak the original tongue, so you do not have to worry about conversing with him. He raised his hand a few inches, almost as though he was reaching for me, then seemed to realize what he was doing and let it drop back to his side. Do not leave this building. But what if something happens to you? Ah, I would be offended had we not only met yesterday. He grinned, but it wasn't a friendly expression. There is no man or woman in this city who can best me. I didn't doubt it. I had seen him fight. But what if... Again his hand rose, and this time he didn't stop himself. He touched my shoulder, then slid his hand down my arm to give my fingers a squeeze. I shall return soon. He strode toward the doorway. I watched him leave,
then turned to face Wenny and nearly jumped out of my shift. He was standing right there, barely a foot away. Apparently I had been too distracted by watching Heru's backside to hear Wenny approach. He still wore his friendly expression, but as I looked into his brown eyes, something darker coalesced, seething just under the surface. Only one being had eyes like that. I started backing away and opened my mouth, but faster than it was humanly possible, when he struck, wrapping one long-fingered hand around my neck. All right, I know that's a terrible spot to stop, but that's where we're going to stop this episode, and I promise we'll continue and resolve this dramatic scene next week. So thank you for joining me, and I'll be back next week to read more of Time Anomaly.